with Roger Pattee, a 2021 inductee into the Michigan High School Lacrosse Coaches Hall of Fame for the year 2021. Roger, first of all, I want to say congratulations. And I think it's a great honor, a long time coming. And we're going to talk a little bit about your career, hopefully a little bit about officiating and how teaching affects that, and all of this stuff about your life going all the way back to Newport. And so first of all, congratulations on the honor. I think it's well deserved.
Thank you. It's greatly appreciated as well. Like
the last couple of interviews we've done, when you got the phone call, what went through your head?
I was surprised. As you know, I retired from officiating in 2015. Other than keeping in touch with former lacrosse colleagues, I pretty much had forgotten about lacrosse, aside from watching NCAA lacrosse still, which I love and do. But I had pretty much withdrawn from the local high school scene.
Okay. Well, like all the other news, Roger, I want to take you all the way back, and we're going to go back all the way to Vermont, where you were born and raised in Newport. So talk a little bit about high school and growing up in Vermont.
I grew up in a small city of 5,000 people in northern Vermont, very close to the Canadian border. At the time, lacrosse wasn't on the scene except in probably a few private prep schools. Went to a small high school, played the three traditional baseball, football, basketball sports. Pretty much if you could walk and chew gum, you played. And I could do both, so I played.
Central Vermont, Western Vermont, Eastern Vermont?
Northern Vermont, north central Vermont, about a mile from the Canadian border, 5-mile bike ride, actually, we would be in Quebec.
The equivalent across Lake Champlain would have been Rouse's Point. Are you familiar with that town at all?
Very familiar. I didn't go there, but my parents were from near St. Albans, Vermont, and I know that all the St. Albans kids made their way to Rouse's Point frequently.
When people speak of upstate New York, I spent a lot of time in Lake Placid. I lived there for a while. When people talk about upstate New York and they'll say they're from Albany, I was kind of chuckled because if you're from Lake Placid, you're 3 or 4 hours north of
that's like saying you're from upstate Vermont and live in Montpelier.
Right,
which is in the center, a little bit north center of the state.
Exactly. What sports did you play in high school?
Baseball, football, and basketball. I did some skiing, but was more interested in basketball than the skiing. So that's where I spent my time. So
from northern Vermont, you headed towards Dartmouth, if I'm not mistaken.
I graduated from high school in 1966 and enrolled at Dartmouth. Was at Dartmouth for 2 years, played some intramural stuff, never played any varsity sports there. Got married after my sophomore year in college, and both of us were in small Ivy League type institutions that at that time were not co-ed. So we decided we'd spend our last 2 years at a big university environment and transferred to Michigan in '68 and graduated in 1970.
How did Michigan get on the radar? What is it about it? I mean, you make explain you want to go to a big university, but between Dartmouth and Michigan, there's a lot of big universities.
Well, we wanted to get away from home and establish our own independence. And so we looked at a number of Midwestern universities, most of the Big Ten schools, and Michigan was a nice fit because it was close enough to get home without too ridiculous a drive at that time.
The bride must have had great confidence in you at the end of your sophomore year to be able to make that kind of travel arrangements and come all the way back to Ann Arbor.
I missed the first part of your comment.
No, I just said your bride must have had great confidence in you to make that trip all the way to Ann Arbor. That you could,
she was pretty interested in getting away as well, and it was a very good experience in Ann Arbor as well.
What was your college? What was your educational background in college? What were you studying for? Now, I know you're a teacher. I'm assuming you had an education degree.
I got my degree in Bachelor of Arts, and my undergraduate work was in sociology. Moved to Detroit with a plan of staying there for a couple of years. My wife was taking an urban teaching program at that time. What was initially going to be a couple of years turned into going on 70 to 50. And we just pretty much ended up settling down in Detroit, and I started a teacher corps program through Wayne State University, got my Master of Arts in Teaching from Wayne in 72, and taught in the Detroit Public Schools for 33 years.
When you started Dartmouth, was there sociology there as well?
I was thinking I was going to be in mathematics, but quickly discovered that mathematics at the college level was far beyond what I had been working on in high school, and sociology turned out to be a nice fit for me personally.
A 19-year-old Roger, what were you thinking about in terms of sociology? Did you see yourself as a sociologist at some point?
Kind of thinking sociology, thinking urban planning at one point, and just drifted into teaching and fell in love with it.
You remember the day you loved when you figured out that this was going to be a life vocation?
Probably after about a year and a half of middle school. I mean, I initially started out in elementary with first and second graders, and that definitely was not going to be a life vocation. Ended up coming back to teaching, left for a year or two, came back to it in mid-70s as a middle school substitute in Detroit. And after about 6 months, fell in love with that age group and just fell in love with teaching middle school kids.
Okay, now I have to ask this question because this has nothing to do with officiating or lacrosse.
Yep.
But coaching middle school, to me, is a little bit like being a special ed teacher. It takes a very special person and a very patient, loving person to be able to teach it, because I have some family members who are middle school teachers, and I would last 5 seconds. And so explain to me what it is that you like about that age and what you fell in love with.
After about 6 months of learning that the process they're going through from 6th to 8th grade is just one of tremendous social and personal growth, and the fact that they're just bouncing off walls trying to figure out who they are. And once I figured that out, then it was just fun to watch the growth and watch them develop as young adult, very young teenagers, but getting to the point where they could beginning to figure out who they were.
Is patience a part of that?
Oh, absolutely. Has to be.
We're going to talk about officiating and your philosophy of officiating, but I would think that being the patient middle school teacher would make you so much more prepared than an average normal person going into officiating, because you've got some background already from your professional world. Was there lessons learned in the classroom that you used on the field?
Probably the biggest lesson is understanding that coaches they're trying to coach their kids, coach their team, that their responses to me weren't personal. Knowing that pretty early on helped through that transition, which I think is probably one of the most difficult things for young officials to get through, is understanding that the coaches are just trying to coach, that it's not personal. They might get wound up, but that's part of the game from their point of view and their side of the equation.
I joke, but the mental acuity of a middle school student might be equal to that of maybe a high school lacrosse coach sometimes. I mean, maybe some equal parts to that, but I get that part of it. Now, you spent a lot of your time, a good portion of your time, at Earhart Middle School in the Detroit Public School System. All right.
Yes, I moved to Earhart, I believe, in 1977 and retired from there in 2007.
All right. So let's connect education with that of wearing stripes and being in the part of the officials world. How does that all come out?
Well, one of the big connections for me probably was that I fell into doing a lot of training for the Michigan Lacrosse Officials Association. I forgot what we used to be called at the time I first started training back in the probably late 80s. But that was kind of a natural fit for me to jump right into serving that function within the Officials Association.
Your officiating gig though was basketball. Am I correct?
Yes.
And you kind of got dragged along. But maybe tell that story.
Sure. Dick Kennedy, who coached football and in the Detroit Catholic League for years, started the program at UD Jesuit in the mid 80s, I think 85. At that time, if you were starting a high school program, you had to recruit an official because they were so short of officials in Michigan, in this area in Michigan high school lacrosse. Dick had seen me officiate. We were colleagues at the school. He was in phys ed, I was in the math department, but he had seen me officiate Catholic League games. Apparently felt that I was good enough that I could learn to officiate lacrosse. So he handed me some VHS tapes, two in particular, one of an NCAA final and one of a club final between Long Island and the Baltimore area. Some big, huge club final. Said, watch these, you'll get it. It's not hard. And at that time, that was my training. That and everything else was on field.
Okay, so when you start out, you've had obviously experience as a high school athlete. Now you're going in to officiate your first game. Was there some thought in your head that you sort of had an understanding of it because you had played the sport? And then my question is, was it a bigger shock than maybe you thought, or was it a pretty easy graduation into that process?
The thing that probably helped some is that I had grown up watching NHL hockey. So some of the penalties and some of the things you had to look for in lacrosse were similar. Probably the hardest thing to adapt to were things like the crease and offsides, which is a whole new ball game for me. But having come from basketball, calling out of bounds, making all those little quick procedural calls was simple, easy. Blowing the whistle long and strong was simple and easy. That all came from my previous officiating experience.
How long did you officiate basketball before lacrosse came along?
I started officiating basketball in the early 70s, probably about 74. And by the time I started lacrosse, I'd been probably working varsity PSL basketball for 3 or 4 years.
So game management and some of the other aspects of officiating where you had some experience, which probably made the rules end of lacrosse a little bit easier.
It helped a lot. I had, there was some rules that I had to learn. There was some judgment in terms of what advantage in lacrosse looked like. Probably my biggest philosophy of officiating is advantage, disadvantage. Play happens and there'd be no advantage gained. Why stop the play? There's no advantage to whatever the defense did. There's no, I won't say blood flowing, but a tap with a stick versus I smacked the kid across the back with my stick. That's a whole big part of officiating, knowing what to call. Coaches always talk about wanting consistency, and what they're looking for is not only consistency from an individual official, ideally they're getting consistency from the crew. Well, if I make a ticky-tack call in the first period, now our crew's in trouble because we're going to have to make those calls all day long, or hear some grief, and rightly so. So try to call advantage early. Try to make the first call one that's obvious to everybody, and then you set yourself up for a much better and smoother game for everybody,
I wanted you to
coaches
kind
and participants.
I wanted you to kind of reminisce as to how you got in as sort of being pulled along as part of that pilot program. If you start a program, you've got to bring an official or bring a body with you. And to kind of point out that attraction of officials is not, finding new officials has been a long endeavor for the MHSAA. This is not a new, I mean, they've been doing this probably since the 60s, probably even before that. There's always been a lack of officials, at least in terms of numbers. So that was kind of my point of reference, which I thought was interesting. So you get into lacrosse, and you kind of work your way up the ladder pretty quick. But one of the things you get involved with Mhslca, and I'm not sure what the acronym was. Is it always been Mhslca?
No, it is not. I want to say we probably became Mhslca in the mid to late 90s.
Okay.
Not a long time before the MHSAA adopted it as a recognized sport.
With whatever the acronym was before Mhslca,
right?
You had your ability came pretty quick. You did a lot. You got work to the top of the sport. Now, part of it was there was less teams than there might have been now, but the other part of that reality is you also, and I'm guessing because of your teaching background, you've been an integral part of the educational factors of that organization prior to Mhslca and as well as Mhslca. And you've been a trainer, you've been a part of that whole thing. I'm assuming they tapped because of your education background.
Certainly the education background helped. It just lent itself naturally to taking up a lot of training responsibilities. I also served as president, vice president, secretary, treasurer at various times in the Officials Association. But I was always involved in the training aspect of it, and felt very natural for me to stand in front of a group and introduce them to the sport and the things they needed to do to comfortably move ahead in their officiating.
What was harder to learn, basketball or lacrosse in the first couple of years?
To officiate for me, probably it's kind of tricky. The rules of basketball I was very familiar with, and from having played and having watched it all my life. At the time I started basketball, I had never officiated, so I had to learn to become a decent official. Once I started lacrosse, I had a lot of the can become a decent official, the game management, the interaction with coaches, the blowing the strong whistle, the looking for advantage versus calling everything that the rules seem to require. So coming to lacrosse, maybe it was easier because all I had to learn was rules and things that I didn't know from other sports.
In a general sense, do you think it's easier to know the sport and go officiate it, or not know the sport? Because you have no bad habits and you have no preconceptions.
I think learning to become an official and learning to do it well probably is the most important thing. And to do that from a non-sports background completely, I'm not sure is easy. Because part of being a good official is understanding the ebb and flow of a game that you're going to know from having played. If you've never played, then I'm not sure that part of it would be easy at all. Now, the flip side of it, if you've played the sport, then you probably have some biases that you bring to your officiating of the sport.
Right.
If you're a long pole close defender, you probably are not looking to call the game quite as closely in terms of penalties, as opposed to if you were skinny, 160-pound attackman who was getting beat up all game and wanted everything called a whole lot closer.
Sure. You've been out a little while, but in the sort of the 2000s, and certainly from the time the MHSA made it a varsity sport in 2004, what just maybe some thoughts and ideas on how you thought the sport's changed from the time you started to maybe to the time you finished?
As I would say with other sports, football comes to mind, hockey comes to mind. The biggest change has probably been taking some of the high physical contact out of the sport. It had started to come out a little bit by the time I started officiating. Certainly, I believe this sport was much more physical in the days of Jim Brown.
Sure.
But that's probably the biggest change, is the physicality, especially as involving the head, has had to change. And I think they at all levels have done a pretty good job of making that happen.
What was your philosophy on handling coaches? And again, those who needed to be handled.
Probably not my strongest point, but
Because
well, just verbally dealing with people, back and forth, the verbal give and take was not something that I found easy.
Okay.
I think as an official, you have to recognize how much of that you can do and how well you do it effectively. If you do it well and do it effectively, then have at it. And everybody knows Bob Bowery, knows him well. That's something Bob does very well.
Yes,
and it's a good thing to have that ability as an official. If you don't have it, you can work on it to some degree. But probably the best thing, if you don't have it, is to understand when you need to address a coach and when you just need to just keep on running. In one ear, out the other, because it's not that critical. Coach has a legitimate question about a call that was made on the field, no problem, stop, address it, move on. Don't stop and get involved in a lengthy discussion. It's not part of the game and not needed.
the least verbiage possible gets you to a better outcome usually.
Oh, absolutely.
And you can't misconstrue silence. I've heard that more than once. So I think
That's a very, very important aspect.
there's some truth to that. With all of your training background, if you had to hone in on a couple of keys, what is it that both players, coaches, and maybe young officials could learn from that you sort of emphasized in the years and years that you taught? What is it we're missing that we have to learn that we could learn from listening to you? It's a hard question.
First of all, for young officials, and then I'll address coaches. For young officials, I think we always talk about look the part, dress professionally, look like you've been on the field before, and that's a big hurdle in step one. Have the strong whistle is another very important step. I had a Big Ten basketball official, George Solomon. Now coaches have to be of our age to know who George was. But he was an excellent Big Ten basketball official for years. And one of the very first basketball meetings I was at, he emphasized cadence with a whistle. He said, first of all, long, strong whistle, then raise your arm. He said, take a little time, because he said in these brief 2 or 3 seconds of your long, strong whistle, you can run a video replay of that play in your head and then sell the call. The sooner young officials can learn that, the more respect, the more acceptance they're going to get on the field. And that's probably number one. And number two is they have to learn how to interact with coaches. And my initial thing is don't interact until you start, other than simple, quick responses, move on. coaches will pretty much let you know if you have to address them further. I think in the 30 years that I did lacrosse, I want to say I only tossed one coach in 30 years. It was at a it was at a Midwest lacrosse second day, muddy fields down in Ohio, 6 inches of mud probably, and we had a no-go call when the ball from my vantage point and the goal line and the goal judge's vantage point hit the top crossbar and came down outside the goal line. From his vantage point, another 30 yards away, he thought it was a goal and came running on the field, middle of the field. And then after I addressed him, and I made a mistake, which is I walked past him to administer the unsportsmanlike conduct, and he proceeded to make some gesture that my partner caught, and my partner informed me. And so I said, "Yep, coach, you want to sit in the bus because you don't like it out here in the mud and the rain either. So have at it."
You don't have to give it up, but would we know the coach?
The younger coaches probably not, because this was probably a good 15 years ago, and he was probably at the tail end of his coaching career. So,
Michigan team or Ohio team?
no, Ohio team.
Okay.
That's why he was after me, because he knew he wasn't going to have to see me again.
It wasn't Arlington, was it?
I don't believe so.
Okay, but I'll leave it at that.
There you
I'll
go.
leave it at that. What could,
And from the coach's point of view in dealing with officials, I would just say that in my experience in basketball and lacrosse, but basketball primarily initially, the best coaches from an official's point of view in terms of to work with and what they said, I would actually have to listen closely to and evaluate quickly in my mind. You know, did I make a mistake, or are they, do I need to call this tight or whatever? Daryl Percival, who was basketball Hall of Fame basketball coach from Highland Park High School.
Yep.
Would work the sideline, and you wouldn't hear boo from him for the whole game, pretty much. Dave Souls from East Catholic High School is another one that comes to mind.
Yep.
Very odd, very little said. And when they said something, it was delivered in a quick, calm, quiet voice. And boy, at that point you listened, because you knew that was something that needed to be said, and you better listen.
Roger, I know I'm old because when you mentioned Mr. Percival, he was actually a JV coach to Jim Wink at Highland Park, and Jim Wink left and went and spent a career for 40 years at Ferris, and was obviously passed on. But the field, the actual field house up at Ferris State is named after Coach Wink. So it's all the parts. Yeah. If you're around enough, you get to know everybody. There's. Right. As a long-term official, I need to ask this question, and I've asked this of almost every official, and it's just for edification. You've had good games, you've had bad games, you've had great games, you've had games that bored you to death, you've had games that were absolutely insightful. But in your career, I can pretty much make a statement that I think is true, and you can maybe expound on this. You've never tried to, all those people in the crowd, hey, let's even it up for the score, let's get one for the other guy. The only thing you as an official do is call what you see. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not so good. But have you ever met an official who said, let's even the score because we've got 7 fouls over here and 2 over here, or cheated, or anything along those lines? And it just, my blood boils when I hear that comment. And again, one more official with the same conscience. That stuff doesn't happen. Is that pretty fair?
I would say that's very fair. I mean, I've worked with officials before who in basketball more than lacrosse, I will say that, where if the foul situation had gotten very one-sided, certainly not because we're looking to call more fouls on team A than team B. It's all a matter of team A is aggressively playing man-to-man. team B's sitting in a tight zone and A's not trying to do anything but shoot over it. Well, who's going to get the fouls?
Right.
I mean, some things are obvious, but I know exactly what you're saying. I've had officials saying, you know, we better look to call the next foul on the team that's not got
But
very many called on them yet.
That's
There's a
communication.
reason for it.
That's communication with your partner.
Absolutely.
That's not a directed statement of oh, by the way, let's make sure we get 3 more on the point guard because, well, we got even the score. And
Yeah.
when I sit among friends, I want my head to fly off because that just doesn't happen.
No.
That just doesn't happen. Your last game, I believe, was the 2015 state final. Am I mistaken?
Absolutely, yes.
You stepped
Brother
away
Rice
because
and Catholic Central. Yes.
you stepped away because there's time.
At that point, my knees were telling me that I had a couple of minor meniscus operations, one in each knee. Fortunately, minor. Fortunately, they took and allowed my career to go on another 4 or 5 years, probably. But I was looking forward to participating in playing some golf and some pickleball and other sports in retirement, and didn't want to run my knees into the ground officiating. And at the point that you're feeling that and losing the enthusiasm to go out every day for 90 or 100 games of lacrosse every year, because the demand certainly was still there.
Yeah.
My tendency when I walked away from a sport was to walk away. That's just my personality. I did the same thing in basketball probably 3 or 4 years earlier, and just decided that, you know, the love and the enthusiasm wasn't there in the way it needed to be, and I was never in it for the money. The money's not enough to be there for that reason. So
Not at $35 a game, $40 a game,
exactly,
whatever it was.
right.
Roger, the last thing I wanted to touch on, you were part of the National Federation of High School Sports rules committees over the years, and you had a chance to participate in that. Just talk about that experience and maybe give us an insight to the National Federation. Basically oversees all sports and all the rules within those sports for high school athletics and kind of governs. There's some things in some states that have specific rules, but they're set the tone for those rule changes and thoughts. Talk a little bit about what it was like to be in that level, because now you're talking not just regional, but sort of a national idea. So can you speak to that at all?
It was very interesting. Got a chance to meet a couple of well-known officials who were on the committee at the same time, and coaches from all over the country, and a couple of administrators. The committee was made up at the time I was on it of I think we had 2 officials, probably 3 or 4 or 5 coaches, and 2 or 3 administrators. So the perspectives that each of them brought to the committee meeting was interesting. Excellent thought, excellent discussion, excellent give and take about what the rule change would mean. Was this something that we really want to change for, and knowing that it's going to impact everybody in the country who follows the Federation book, and pretty well thought out, pretty well orchestrated process from the people at the Federation office. Did a nice job of sending out surveys prior to the meetings, asking people what rules changes from previous years they thought were working well, what weren't, what changes they would suggest. Some of the process was following college. College, I think, was kind of leading the way in terms of changes that were being made. And that's kind of understandable, given that high school kids, some of them are looking to go on and play at the college level. but very interesting and very well thought out, very careful process was my experience.
Fair to make the assumption that most rules that slide downhill are usually safety rules, more than anything else, to make sure we're protecting players, and some of it's procedural, but isn't a lot of it's for safety?
To some degree. I think college maybe a little more physical and want the game to be slightly more physical.
Right.
So to some degree, maybe the safety rules are as strong at the high school level and thinking at the junior, middle school and below levels.
Right.
I think speed of play, substitution, some of those procedural things that we had to be careful of, because colleges, you're looking at a 30 to 50 man roster at the Division I level, which is where a lot of their rules get made. Whereas high school, you're going to have teams that have 15 kids. So we had to be a little bit careful and just rushing to adopt some of the college rules.
Well, and the safety issues for high school certainly first, and I think it's a little less, not less safe, but a little more opportunity as you move up the ladder. You have a high school game, and you see a high school coach doing uncatchable. Well, unfortunately, that's not a rule in high school. It's a rule in college. It's not a rule in. So sometimes the guys who are watching Sunday, they come down and watch a high school game on Friday. They're trying to interpret the high school game with NFL rule books, and there's as many as 50 rule differences between pros and high school. I think that's sometimes where confusion gets with the average fan,
with the fans
kind of watching. I think that's
absolutely.
And then they scream at the officials not knowing the rules. I think that's something that they could take a class, I suppose, to some extent. So
yeah, well, officials have to it's interesting because beginning officials, the fans are the closest they can possibly be on the field, right, versus the higher up you go, the further away they get them. Think about a middle school game when they're encroaching on the 6-yard safety zone on the sidelines versus a college game where they're probably 20 yards away from the sideline up in the stands somewhere. So
I think of Royal Oak Shrine, which I'm sure you've officiated there.
Oh yes.
The 3-point line in the corner is also the out of bounds line. So you can't make a 3-point in the corner because it's not bounds. Because the gym was too small. Just the things you have to deal with when you officiate at the lower levels. But now, Roger, you're going in as a contributing member of the Hall of Fame, and I guess the last question I want to leave you with is, what do you want people to remember about Roger Pattee as an official?
That's a good question. That he demonstrated that he loved the game and had no purpose calling the game other than to see that it was played in as fair and reasonable a way as possible. And I think that's the goal of most officials. We have no desire to do anything but make sure this game gets played in a way that the players can enjoy it. The coaches won't have too many concerns, and the game's played in a safe and fair manner for all participants.
When we have our committee meeting to discuss who is going in and who might be potentially eligible and worthy, I do a one-word quiz. You got to describe everybody with one word that you know of them. And some guys think they don't understand, but the word that came to mind for me for you was gentleman. I've never saw you on a field and never saw you in a game when you were not the ultimate gentleman, despite being maybe screamed at, yelled at. You're always accommodating. You always took the time with kids. And I have such great respect for that, regardless of the fact you were also a great official, but you were such a gentleman. And I think it gave a lot of respect to you, but more importantly, I think a lot of people followed and the way you officiated, being the trainer. I think there's a lot of guys that are officiating that followed your model. And for that, I want to thank you. I want to certainly congratulate you for making the Hall and wish you the best. And I appreciate the time talking with us.
Thank you, Greg. And I'm very appreciative of the honor and thank the coaches committee, all involved. Very appreciative. Thank you very much.